It was a sweltering summer afternoon in New Orleans, and the heavy air made every movement on the construction site feel like an extra effort. David Harris, a burly 46-year-old man, was at the top of a ladder, adjusting electrical wires while chatting with his colleagues. He was known for his impeccable work ethic, despite the hardships life had thrown at him. "David, are you almost done up there?" one of his co-workers called out with a grin. "Just a few more minutes, and I'll be down," David replied, focused on his task. Suddenly, a metallic clatter echoed across the site. The ladder wobbled for a moment, and before David could react, he lost his balance. His body hit the ground with a brutal impact, causing everyone around to stop in shock. "David!" one of the men shouted, rushing to him. David's face was twisted in pain, and he could barely move his legs. "Call an ambulance, quickly!" another shouted, his hands shaking as he tried to keep David conscious. "Stay with us, David." David felt excruciating pain spreading through his body. Each breath seemed like an immense effort, and his eyes, half closed, were fixed on the bright blue sky of New Orleans. He felt his consciousness wavering as he heard sirens in the distance. A few minutes later, paramedics arrived and carefully placed him on a stretcher. David heard fragments of their conversations, but his mind was clouded by pain and fear of what was to come. "Stay calm, sir. We're going to get you to the hospital as quickly as possible," one of the paramedics said, adjusting the oxygen mask on David's face. As they drove to the hospital, David thought about his wife, Vanessa, and their 2 children. What would they do if something happened to him? Worry began to take over as the vehicle bounced along the streets of New Orleans. When they arrived at the hospital, the chaos was palpable. David was rushed inside on a stretcher, but even in his critical condition, he felt something was off. He was surrounded by nurses and doctors, but the attention he expected wasn't forthcoming. He was left in a waiting room for almost an hour while other patients with visibly less severe injuries were seen before him. "Please," he managed to say to a passing nurse. I'm not well, the pain." The nurse, a white woman with a hurried expression, glanced briefly at him but did nothing more than murmur, "I'll be right back," before hurrying away. David closed his eyes, trying to control the despair consuming him. Each minute felt like an eternity, and the feeling of invisibility was overwhelming. David woke up feeling confused, his body heavy. The cold fluorescent light of the hospital flickered above him. He tried to move, but the pain radiating from his legs and back was almost unbearable. He moaned softly, hoping to attract someone's attention, but the hallway around him was empty. "Vanessa," he whispered, hoping his wife already knew what had happened. Minutes turned into hours. David, still dazed from the accident, watched other patients arrive and receive immediate attention. They passed by him as if he were invisible. A white nurse, with an impassive face and a clipboard in her hands, hurried past him. David gathered his strength to call out to her. "Excuse me, please. I need help," he said, trying to grab the woman's arm. The nurse instinctively pulled away, almost uncomfortable. "We're taking care of it. Please be patient," she said quickly, without even looking at him. Then she continued walking, disappearing down the hallway. David sighed deeply, trying to manage his frustration. He wasn't sure if it was his appearance, his dusty work clothes, or simply being a black man, but the sensation of being ignored was palpable. There he was, lying on a stretcher, feeling sharp pains throughout his body, while other patients with minor cuts and simpler issues received all the attention. Why isn't anyone looking at me?" he murmured, a tear sliding down his cheek. When another nurse, a young black woman named Erica, finally approached, she looked at him with genuine concern. "Hi, sir. How are you feeling? Have they examined you yet?" "No. I've been here 4 hours. No one has done anything," David said, his voice almost breaking with relief at finally being seen. Erica frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "This isn't right. I'll get someone right away," she promised, looking at him with empathy. "Thank you," David murmured, feeling momentarily relieved. But despite Erica's promise, time continued to pass, and once again, he was left waiting. The silence of the hallway was becoming deafening, and his patience was wearing thin. A doctor entered the room shortly after, adjusting his glasses and quickly glancing at David's chart. He was white, with graying hair, and seemed to be there just to check off his duties. "So, you're Harris, right? Looks like you had a work accident, fractured a few ribs. We'll give you some pain medication and send you home. Rest for a few weeks, okay?" the doctor said without making eye contact. David looked at him incredulously. "That's it? What about my legs? The pain in my back? I can barely breathe." The doctor sighed, as if annoyed by the insistence. "Look, it's normal. It'll get better with time. We'll give you a painkiller, nothing serious. The pain will go away." David knew something was wrong, but the doctor didn't seem interested in hearing his concerns. "But doctor, I'm telling you the pain is getting worse. I think it's more serious." The doctor shrugged. "If that's the case, come back. Now, we're going to release you." Without further explanation, the doctor left the room, leaving David in a whirlwind of anger and confusion. He wanted to believe everything would be okay, but the cold, rushed treatment made him doubt. As he waited for his discharge, a nurse approached with a pill and a glass of water. "Here, take this. You'll feel better soon," she said without enthusiasm. David took the medication, but the pain inside him was more than just physical. It came from a deeper wound, the feeling of being treated like he didn't matter. He was scared and lost, but mostly outraged. On the way home, David leaned against the car window while his wife, Vanessa, drove. The sky over New Orleans seemed heavier than usual, almost reflecting the tension David felt inside. Every bump in the road sent waves of pain through his body, but he tried to hide it to keep Vanessa from worrying more. "Are you okay, honey?" Vanessa asked, glancing at him out of the corner of her eye. David sighed deeply. "No, I'm not, Vanessa. Those doctors didn't listen to me. They just sent me home with pain medication, but something feels really wrong." Vanessa tightened her grip on the steering wheel, clearly worried. "This doesn't make sense. You fell from a great height, can barely move, and all they do is send you home with meds? They didn't do any detailed exams?" David shook his head slowly. "They just did a quick check, said it was broken ribs, nothing more. They didn't even do a full x-ray. When I tried to talk about my back and legs, the doctor didn't want to listen." Vanessa huffed, frustration evident in her voice. "This isn't right. They didn't give you the proper attention, David, and I know exactly why." David looked at her with tired eyes. "Because of my skin color? I've thought about that too. But what can I do? We need answers, but it seems like to them, my pain doesn't matter." Silence fell between them, each immersed in their thoughts. Silence fell between them, each immersed in their thoughts. When they arrived home, Vanessa helped David out of the car and guided him to the couch. He sat down with difficulty, trying to find a position that would ease the pain. "Do you want me to get you something to eat?" Vanessa offered, trying to be practical. "No, I'm not hungry. Just want to rest a bit," he replied, his voice weary. David lay down, but the pain was persistent. Even with the painkillers, his body seemed to plead for help. The worst part was the uncertainty, the feeling that something was seriously wrong, but no one was willing to listen. He closed his eyes, trying to relax, but flashes of the accident kept replaying in his mind. Hours later, as night fell, Vanessa sat beside him on the couch. "I was thinking, if you don't start feeling better, we'll have to go back to the hospital tomorrow or find another one. This can't go on like this." David nodded, too exhausted to argue. "Yeah, you're right. But for now, I just want to sleep. Let's see how I feel tomorrow." Vanessa watched him with concern. She knew David wasn't one to complain easily, and seeing her husband so vulnerable broke her heart. Still, she tried to hide her anxiety. In the middle of the night, David woke up with excruciating pain in his back, as if something was tearing inside. He gasped, trying not to alarm Vanessa, but his low groans eventually woke her. "David, what's wrong? Is it hurting more?" she asked, quickly sitting next to him. "Yeah, it feels like it's getting worse. I can barely breathe without feeling like my ribs are breaking again," he murmured, trying to adjust himself in bed. Vanessa immediately got up. "This can't go on. First thing tomorrow, we're going back to the hospital. I won't let them treat you like this again." David looked at her, grateful for her support. I just want to be treated like anyone else, Vanessa. I just want them to listen, to do the right tests. It feels like I'm invisible to them. Vanessa held David's hand. You're not invisible. Tomorrow, they're going to have to see you, and if they don't, I'll make sure they do. They sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. David knew that despite Vanessa's determination, he would face more challenges. The system seemed stacked against him from the start, but at that moment, he just wanted a bit of peace, relief from the relentless pain that consumed him. When morning finally came, Vanessa prepared to take him back to the hospital, determined to ensure David got the treatment he deserved. However, inside David, a doubt was growing. Even with all the effort, would he finally be heard? He hoped so, because if not, he feared what might come next. The days following David's return from the hospital were tough. He could barely get off the couch without feeling searing pain. The pain medication provided temporary relief, but once it wore off, the agony returned with a vengeance. Vanessa was by his side whenever she could, but there were bills to pay, and she couldn't abandon work completely. David, a man who had always prided himself on being strong and resilient, now felt a growing frustration. The lack of proper treatment at the hospital and the feeling that his case had been ignored continued to erode his confidence. One morning, as Vanessa was getting ready to leave, David tried to get up on his own, determined to dress and maybe take a walk around the house. You need to rest, David. The pain is still there, Vanessa said, watching with concern as he struggled to rise. I can't just sit around all the time, Ness. I'm going to go crazy if I keep this up. I need to move, do something, David replied. His face contorted with pain as he tried to stretch his back. Vanessa sighed, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. I know you want to, but you need to be careful. What if something gets worse? You're still injured, David. We should go to another hospital, try again. David shook his head. And be treated the same way? Wait for hours just to be sent home with more painkillers? I can't stand this indifference anymore. I just want to go back to work, live my life, but it feels like nobody cares. He walked with slow steps to the kitchen, trying to hide the growing pain in his legs and back. Vanessa followed, anxious. David, I know this is consuming you, but you can't just ignore how serious this is. We need to do something. I can try to talk to someone at the hospital again. David sighed deeply and leaned against the kitchen table. Vanessa, they didn't listen to me the first time. Why would it be any different now? She crossed her arms, determined. Because I'll be there this time, and I won't accept them treating you like last time. I promise. David looked at his wife, grateful but also worn out. He knew Vanessa was an unwavering force, but something inside him told him the fight would be long. I appreciate it, Ness. Really. But for now, I need to try to move around. I can't just wait for things to get better. Vanessa, feeling David's pain, both physical and emotional, came closer and hugged him. I understand, and I'll do everything I can to help. But you have to promise me that if things get worse, we'll go back to the hospital, even if it's the last place you want to be. David nodded, though not very convincingly. I promise. But for now, I'll try to hang on a bit longer. I can't let this pain take over. I need to fight. Vanessa kissed him on the forehead and grabbed her keys. I'll call you during the day. If you need anything, let me know. And please, don't try to do more than your body can handle. I'll try, Ness. Be careful. As Vanessa left, David stood by the window, thinking about how life could change in an instant. A simple accident had turned his daily routine into a constant battle. He wanted to be the strong man his family knew, the father and husband who didn't rely on anyone. But now, everything seemed harder. He felt trapped, both physically and emotionally, and with each passing day, the pain became more than just a health issue. He looked at his phone, thinking about calling work. The supervisor had left a message asking how he was. David knew he needed to respond, but he didn't know what to say. How could he explain that, even though he was home, every movement was a reminder of the medical neglect he had endured? Picking up the phone, he dialed the work number. David, how are you holding up, man? The supervisor's voice came through the line. I've been better, David answered with a weak laugh. Recovery's been tougher than I expected. I understand. We're all rooting for you. You know, The team misses you, but don't worry about coming back before you're ready. We need you healthy." "Thanks, I appreciate it," David replied, hesitating. He didn't want to admit that he was far from okay. Hanging up the phone, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of bills. Each piece of paper seemed like a cruel reminder that he couldn't afford to stay idle for much longer. The struggle to keep going, despite the pain and frustration, was just beginning. David was lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, when the doorbell rang. It was the middle of the afternoon, and he knew Vanessa was still at work. Struggling, he got up, feeling the familiar pain radiating through his body, and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, he found his longtime friend Marcus standing there with a concerned look. "Hey man, came to check on you," Marcus said, stepping in and giving David a careful hug. David winced in pain as he embraced him. "I've been better, but I'm trying to keep going. Come on in." They sat in the living room, and Marcus looked at David with even deeper concern. "Man, you look worse than the last time I saw you. Vanessa told me things aren't easy. What kind of treatment did you get at the hospital?" David sighed, rubbing his shoulders. "They treated me like just another number, Marcus. Said it was just a fracture, sent me home with pain meds, and that was it. They didn't listen when I talked about my legs and back." Marcus shook his head, clearly irritated. "Seriously? That's unacceptable, David. We know what's going on here. Do you think if it were someone else so white, man, for example, they would have treated him with the same negligence?" David shrugged, looking exhausted. "At this point, I have no doubts. And the worst part is that now the pain is getting worse. I'm feeling numbness in my legs. Every day, it feels like my body is falling apart." Marcus's face grew more intense with concern. "Man, we need to do something. I can help you find another place, maybe a better hospital or a specialist who will take you seriously." David looked at him, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "I'd really appreciate that, Marcus. I'm just so tired of feeling like I'm invisible. I need someone who will really listen and help me get better." Marcus nodded firmly. "We'll get this sorted out. You don't have to go through this alone. Let's find a way to get you the treatment you deserve." David managed a faint smile. "Thanks, Marcus. That means a lot. Right now, it's hard to see a way forward, but having you and Vanessa by my side makes a huge difference." They sat together, talking about possible next steps, and for the first time in days, David felt a small spark of hope. Even though the road ahead was still uncertain and fraught with challenges, knowing that he had support made the burden a little easier to bear. Marcus looked at him with a mix of anger and sadness. "You can't just leave it like this. You need to go back to the hospital. You have to demand proper treatment." David frowned, already tired of hearing that. "And what's going to be different this time? I'm not up for spending more hours waiting just to be ignored again." Marcus paused, thinking for a moment. "What if you went to another hospital? Got a second opinion? There has to be a way to make them take you seriously, man." David remained silent, clearly hesitant. He knew Marcus was right, but the thought of reliving the distressing hospital experience wore him out. "Look, David, I'm telling you this because I care about you. You can't keep going like this. You might end up getting worse, and then there's no going back," Marcus insisted, leaning forward. David finally looked his friend in the eye and nodded, albeit reluctantly. "I know. It's exhausting, you know? It's tiring to have to fight for something that should be basic, but maybe I should try another place. Who knows?" Marcus put a hand on David's shoulder. "I'll go with you if you need me. We can't let this situation continue." David thanked him with a nod, but before he could respond further, Vanessa walked in carrying shopping bags. "Hi, love," she said, placing the bags on the table and heading toward them. "Hi, Marcus." "Hey, Vanessa. I was here trying to convince your husband to go to another hospital," Marcus said, looking at her. Vanessa nodded, clearly relieved to hear that. "I've been saying the same thing. He can't keep going like this. David's been feeling numbness in his legs. That's not normal." David huffed, impatient. "I know it's not normal, Vanessa. I just don't know if I can go through that frustration again." Vanessa sat next to him, holding his hand. "David, we don't have a choice. I know you're tired, but we have to try. And Marcus is right. Maybe another hospital will be better. We can't give up." David looked at both of them, feeling the pressure build up. He knew they were all right, but at the same time, he felt on the brink of collapse. Okay, he finally said. Tomorrow, we'll go to another hospital. But if it's the same thing, I swear I'll never set foot in one again. Vanessa smiled, relieved, and squeezed his hand. It will be different, David. We'll find someone who really listens to you. Marcus nodded. That's right, brother. We won't let them treat you as invisible again. We'll sort this out tomorrow. David looked at his friends, feeling a mix of hope and apprehension. What they didn't know, however, was how difficult the next battle would be. The struggle to be heard was far from over, and he could only hope that this time things would be different. The next morning, Vanessa helped David get ready for the hospital. The pain in his back and legs was unbearable, and he could barely move without help. Vanessa knew the situation was worsening, but tried to stay optimistic, believing that the new hospital would provide answers. Come on, love. I know it hurts, but this time, we're going to get real treatment, Vanessa said. Helping David put on his shoes, David took a deep breath, forcing a tired smile. I just hope it's not another disappointment. I don't know if I have the energy to deal with this again, Ness. Vanessa looked at him with tenderness but determination. This time will be different. And if they don't listen to you, I will make sure they do. I promise. As they drove to the new hospital, the silence in the car was filled with tension. Marcus had promised to meet them there, and Vanessa knew his presence would make David feel more secure. The feeling of abandonment at the first hospital was still fresh in his mind. But now, with Vanessa and Marcus by his side, he felt a little more prepared to face whatever came next. When they arrived at the hospital, Marcus was already waiting outside. Hey, brother, ready for this? He asked with an encouraging smile. David gave a nod, trying to stay strong. Let's see what happens this time. I hope we have better luck here. The three of them went in together, and soon Vanessa went to the reception desk to check David in. She maintained a firm posture, determined to ensure he received the attention he deserved. My husband had an accident and has been experiencing back and leg pain. He went to the hospital a few days ago, but they didn't do a full exam. The situation is getting worse, and we need a detailed diagnosis, Vanessa said. Looking directly at the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a polite smile, typed in the information and looked at Vanessa and David. We'll see what we can do. A doctor will see you soon. Please wait in the waiting area. David and Marcus sat side by side, while Vanessa remained standing, visibly anxious. Do you think they'll take it seriously this time? David asked, looking at Vanessa. She sighed but kept her voice firm. I don't think, David. I know they will. We won't let them send you away without listening to you. We'll get answers. After some time, a young doctor with brown hair and glasses called David's name. He struggled to get up, supported by Vanessa and Marcus, and the three of them followed the doctor to an exam room. Hello, David. My name is Dr. Thompson. I heard you had an accident and that you're in a lot of pain. Let's see what we can do to help, the doctor said with a friendly smile. David looked at the doctor, trying not to have too many expectations. Yes, doctor. I fell off a ladder a few days ago. They said I had some broken ribs, but since then, the pain in my back and legs has only gotten worse. I've even felt numbness in my legs. I'm worried something more serious might be happening. Dr. Thompson frowned, showing concern. Numbness in your legs? That definitely needs to be investigated. Did you have any comprehensive imaging done, like an MRI or a CT scan? David shook his head. No, they only did a quick x-ray and said it was just broken ribs. They gave me pain meds and sent me home. The doctor looked at Vanessa and Marcus, who were visibly upset by the account. That's unacceptable. Numbness in the legs could indicate a neurological issue or a problem with the spine. I'll order an MRI immediately. Vanessa let out a sigh of relief, finally feeling that someone was taking the situation seriously. Thank you, doctor. That's all we wanted from the start. Someone who listens. Dr. Thompson smiled slightly. You're right to seek a second opinion. I'll make sure we conduct all necessary tests to find out what's going on. As the doctor left the room to arrange the exam, David looked at Vanessa and Marcus with a relieved expression, though there was still worry in his eyes. I can't believe someone is finally going to listen to me, David said, letting out a sigh. I told you it would be different this time, Vanessa replied, holding his hand. Marcus smiled, encouraging him. We're in this together, brother. Now we're going to get some answers. This is just the beginning. As they awaited the start of the exams, David felt a mix of emotions. He knew that, although there was hope of finally getting a diagnosis, the truth that would come to light could be serious. But either way, he was ready to face whatever came next. Finally, he wasn't alone in this fight. David was lying on the examination table, staring at the ceiling of the hospital as the MRI machine made its repetitive noises. The sound was uncomfortable, but not as much as the constant pain that had been with him since the accident. He thought about Vanessa, waiting outside, anxious for answers, and Marcus, who had taken the day off just to support him. Finally, after weeks of uncertainty, they were close to finding out what was really going on. Later, he was brought back to the waiting area, where Vanessa and Marcus were waiting for him. So, how did it go? Vanessa asked, holding his hand as he was settled into a chair. Yeah, now we just have to wait for the results, David replied, trying to mask his anxiety. He looked at Marcus, who was sitting in the other chair with his hands clasped. Thanks for being here, man. Marcus nodded. No need to thank me, brother. You do the same for me. Soon after, Dr. Thompson returned to the room with a serious expression. He held a tablet in his hands and pulled up a chair to sit next to David. David, we have the results from the MRI. I'm sorry to say the news isn't good, the doctor began, his voice soft but firm. Vanessa squeezed David's hand tightly, already bracing for what was to come. What's going on, doctor? She asked, her voice tense. Dr. Thompson looked at the couple, adjusting his glasses before continuing. David, your fall caused more than just rib fractures. The MRI shows you have a herniated disc, and it's pressing on the nerves in your spine, which is causing the numbness in your legs. If left untreated, this could lead to permanent damage. David fell silent, processing the words. He knew something was wrong, but hearing that there could be permanent damage was a hard blow to take. Permanent damage? What does that mean? He asked, trying to stay calm but feeling his heart race. Dr. Thompson took a deep breath. If the proper treatment isn't done in time, you could lose mobility in your legs. The good news is that we're catching it now, before it gets worse. But I'll be honest, you need surgery to correct the problem. Vanessa covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filled with concern. Surgery? So, this is serious then? Yes, it's serious. But the procedure can prevent the problem from worsening. The sooner we do the surgery, the better the chances for a full recovery, the doctor explained, keeping his tone calm. David lowered his head, feeling the weight of the news. He had spent weeks battling pain and frustration, only to discover that his situation was even more serious than he had thought. And all of this could have been avoided if they had done these tests from the beginning, he asked, his voice tinged with bitterness. Dr. Thompson hesitated for a moment. It's possible. If the tests had been done sooner, the problem might have been identified earlier. I'm sorry you've had to go through this, David. Marcus, who had been quiet until then, shook his head in disbelief. This is outrageous. If they had done their job right at the first hospital, you wouldn't be in this position now. Vanessa, still holding David's hand, looked at the doctor with tears in her eyes. What do we do now, doctor? How much time do we have before things get worse? I'll schedule the surgery as soon as possible. The sooner we address this, the better. I'll talk to the surgical team and arrange everything for the next few days, Dr. Thompson replied, standing up. I'll leave you to talk for a bit. I'll be back soon with more information. As the doctor left the room, silence took over. David looked at Vanessa and then at Marcus, trying to find the right words. I don't even know what to say. How did everything go so wrong so quickly? David said, shaking his head, still processing the gravity of the situation. Vanessa, with tears in her eyes, moved closer and hugged him. We're going to get through this, David. Now that we know what's going on, we can face it together. Everything will be okay. I know it will, David replied, though his voice was filled with uncertainty. But it's frustrating to think about everything that happened due to negligence. How could they ignore me like that? And what if it had been too late? Marcus, who had been observing in silence, finally spoke up. That's the hardest part, man. It wasn't just a mistake. It was indifference. You had to go through weeks of pain because of how they treated you. But now, you're going to overcome this. We'll be here with you. David nodded, knowing he had Vanessa and Marcus's support, but still feeling a mix of anger and fear. The prospect of surgery was daunting, and the fact that it could have been avoided only fueled his frustration. As they sat in silence, waiting for more news, David felt like he was just at the beginning of a new battle. He knew recovery would be tough, but he was determined to fight, not just for his health but for Vanessa and his family as well. Days passed since the conversation with Dr. Thompson, and fear and anxiety weighed heavily on David's heart. The surgery was scheduled for the end of the week. He and Vanessa were at home, trying to mentally prepare for what was to come, but the atmosphere was heavy. They both knew that surgery was the only option, but the weight of everything that had happened, the negligence at the first hospital, the seriousness of the diagnosis, made it hard to find peace. On the morning of the surgery, Vanessa was standing in the kitchen, preparing coffee, while David, sitting on the sofa, stared at the turned-off television. He had barely slept the night before, his thoughts relentless. "Are you ready?" Vanessa asked softly, setting a cup of coffee beside him. David looked at the coffee but made no move to take the cup. "I don't think anyone is really ready for something like this, right?" Vanessa sighed, sitting down next to him. "I know, but I'm here with you, David. And Marcus is too. He said he'd meet us at the hospital before the surgery." David nodded. "I know, but I can't stop thinking that all of this could have been avoided. If they had done the tests when I went to the first hospital, maybe it wouldn't have gotten to this point." Vanessa held his hand tightly. "It's an injustice, I know, but now we need to focus on your recovery. That's our next step. And after that, we'll figure out what to do about what happened." "I'm so angry, Ness. They didn't even care. How could they? I was there, suffering, and they just sent me home. If this had happened to someone else, would they have acted the same way?" Vanessa looked at him, her expression a mix of pain and anger. "I wonder that too. If you were someone else, if you were white, maybe they would have treated you differently. But right now, the only thing that matters is getting you back to health." David took a deep breath, trying to absorb what Vanessa was saying. He knew she was right, but it wasn't easy to accept that his life was at risk because of negligence and prejudice. "I just want to get through this intact, Vanessa. I don't want to lose the ability to walk. I don't want to be a burden to you." "Hey, don't say that," Vanessa interrupted, turning to look at him directly. "You'll never be a burden to me. We're in this together. You're my husband, my partner, and we'll come out of this stronger." David looked at her for a long moment before slowly nodding. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You don't need to think about that because I'll always be here," Vanessa replied with a gentle smile. Vanessa's phone buzzed, interrupting the moment. It was a message from Marcus. "On my way to the hospital. See you there. Marcus is heading to the hospital now. I think it's time for us to get ready to go too," Vanessa said, standing up. David glanced at the wall clock. Time seemed to be moving too quickly, and the surgery was approaching. He got up slowly, feeling the throbbing pain in his back and legs. Each movement was a reminder of how much worse his situation had become. He grabbed the bag Vanessa had already packed with clothes and essentials for the hospital and quietly headed out to the car. At the hospital, Marcus met them at the entrance. "Hey, brother. How are you holding up?" he asked, giving David a quick hug. "Hanging in there," David replied, forcing a smile. "Let's hope this all gets sorted out soon. It'll be all right. Dr. Thompson is good. He'll take care of you," Marcus said with a firm and encouraging tone. After a few hours of preparation and medical instructions, David was taken to the surgical center. The atmosphere at the hospital was tense for Vanessa and Marcus, who waited in the waiting room. The clock on the wall seemed to stand still, each second feeling like an eternity. Vanessa looked at Marcus, her voice low. "I don't know how he'll react after the surgery. What if things don't turn out as we hope?" Marcus, despite his own anxiety, tried to keep a positive tone. "He's going to be okay, and if things don't go as planned, we'll be right here with him. The important thing is that he has a chance now, a chance he didn't have at the start." Vanessa ran her fingers through her hair nervously. "I just want him to get his life back, you know? To be able to walk without pain, without all this frustration." "He will," Marcus replied, More confidently, "David is strong, Ness. He's been through so much. This is just another fight he'll win." After hours of anxious waiting, Dr. Thompson entered the room. Vanessa and Marcus immediately stood up. "How is he?" Vanessa asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Thompson smiled slightly. "The surgery was a success. We managed to relieve the pressure on his spine, and he's stable now. Recovery will be slow, but he has a good chance of regaining full mobility over time with physical therapy." Vanessa felt tears streaming down her face, but this time, they were tears of relief. "Thank God. Thank you, Doctor." Marcus gave Dr. Thompson a light pat on the shoulder. "You saved my brother, Doctor. Thank you." "I did what any doctor should have done from the start," Dr. Thompson replied. "He'll need a lot of support during the recovery process, but with your support, he'll do well." As Vanessa and Marcus made their way to the recovery room to see David, she felt as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The battle was far from over, but at least now they had hope. David was slowly waking up in the recovery room. His eyes blinked against the bright hospital lights, and he felt numbness in his back and legs, still under the effects of the anesthesia. Vanessa and Marcus were by his side, anxiously waiting for any sign that he was conscious. "David? Honey, can you hear me?" Vanessa called softly, leaning in close. David opened his eyes slowly, the sound of Vanessa's voice guiding him back to reality. I'm here," he murmured, his voice still weak. Marcus moved closer, holding David's shoulder firmly. "Hey man, you made it. The surgery was a success." David tried to move, but a wave of pain made him stop. He let out a low groan. I can't feel my legs properly. Is that normal?" Vanessa looked at the doctor who was standing nearby, waiting for some guidance. Dr. Thompson, observing David's reaction, responded calmly. "That's normal at first, David. The anesthesia is still in your system, and your nerves are adjusting after the surgery. The sensation will gradually return, but it will be a slow process." David took a deep breath, still trying to process everything. He was relieved to have made it through the surgery, but the thought of a long and uncertain recovery troubled him. "So, I'm not going to be walking anytime soon, am I?" Dr. Thompson shook his head. "Unfortunately not. You'll need intensive physical therapy, but with time and effort, the chances are good that you'll regain full mobility. It will require patience." Vanessa squeezed David's hand, trying to convey confidence. "We'll get through this together, one step at a time, okay?" David looked at her, the fatigue and frustration still evident on his face. "I know. I just didn't expect it to be this hard." Marcus, always trying to keep spirits up, smiled. "You've already been through the hardest part, brother. Now it's just a matter of moving forward, and we'll be with you every step of the way." The following days in the hospital were a mix of small progress and moments of frustration. David was moved to a regular room, where visits from Vanessa and Marcus became a daily routine. However, he began to realize just how much of a true test of patience his recovery would be. On the morning when the physical therapist arrived for the first session, David felt nervous. He still couldn't move his legs fully, and the idea of having to learn to walk again made him uneasy. "Good morning, David," said the physical therapist, a burly man named Jack, who always seemed to have a smile on his face. "Today we'll start slow, but I'll need your full focus. Are you ready?" David looked at Jack and then at Vanessa, who was sitting beside the bed. I am, but honestly, I don't know how this is going to go." Jack smiled encouragingly. "It's going to be tough at first, but that's normal. You'll feel frustrated. Just remember that every little progress is a victory, and over time, those little victories will add up." David sighed and tried to mentally prepare for what was coming. Jack and the nurse helped him sit on the edge of the bed. The pain was constant, and his legs still felt heavy and distant, as if they weren't part of his body. "Let's try to stand a bit today, just to see how your body responds. Don't push yourself too hard. I'll help you hold on to the bars," Jack explained, adjusting the equipment around David. With Vanessa watching attentively and Jack's support, David attempted to stand. He felt his arms shaking as he put weight on his hands, and his legs felt unstable, almost like jelly. "Go slow, David," Vanessa said, her voice full of encouragement. "You can do it." With great effort, he managed to stand for a few seconds before his legs began to give way. I can't do it," David said, panting, as Jack held him to prevent a fall. "Yes, you can," Jack replied firmly. "This is just the beginning. Today, you stood up. Tomorrow, it'll be a little easier. That's how it works." David sat back on the bed, sweating and breathing heavily. He felt defeated, as if progress was beyond his reach. "I feel useless," he murmured, looking at the floor. Vanessa came closer and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not useless, David. This is just the beginning. Look at what you've already been through. Just getting this far shows how strong you are." "She's right," Marcus said, entering the room at that moment. "You're the most stubborn guy I know, and that's going to help you now. Remember when we used to play basketball, and you'd always come back to the court, even after getting hurt? It's the same thing here. Only now you're fighting for something even bigger." David looked at his friends, knowing they were right but still feeling overwhelmed. "I just want this to be over," he admitted, his voice full of frustration. "It will be over," Vanessa said softly. "But until then, we'll walk with you, step by step." In the following days, David continued with his physical therapy sessions, and although progress was slow, he began to notice small improvements. He knew the road would be long, but the constant presence of Vanessa and Marcus gave him the strength to keep going. Sitting in his room one night, David reflected on everything that had happened. The negligence that nearly cost him his mobility, the physical and emotional pain, and now, the arduous path of recovery. But deep down, he knew he had something many people in his situation didn't: unconditional support, and that made all the difference. "I'm going to get through this," he murmured to himself, determined to move forward despite the challenges. "One way or another, I'm going to get through this." David's progress was visible, but slow. Weeks of physical therapy began to show results. He could now stand for longer periods and even take a few steps with assistance. But the physical recovery was only part of the process. The emotional scar left by medical negligence still haunted him, and the feeling of being treated as invisible continued to weigh heavily. That morning, David was sitting on his bed, adjusting his feet on the crutches. The sun was streaming through the window, creating a contrast almost cruel with what he felt inside. Vanessa walked into the room with a hopeful smile, trying to keep the atmosphere light, but she knew there was something bothering David. "Hey, good morning, love. How are you feeling today?" she asked, placing a cup of coffee beside him. David shrugged, his expression closed off. "Physically, I'm a bit better, I guess. But mentally, I'm not sure." Vanessa sat down beside him, concerned. She knew that it wasn't just David's body that needed healing. He was still carrying the memories of negligence, the indifference at the first hospital. It was something that seemed to haunt him more each day. "Do you want to talk about it?" Vanessa asked gently. David took a deep breath and shook his head. "I don't know if it helps. Everything that happened keeps coming back to me. I keep thinking about those first days, how they didn't care, like I was nothing." Vanessa nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "I understand, David. I feel that anger too. But maybe it's time we faced it. Somehow." David looked at her, his eyes reflecting doubt. "And how do we face something like this? How do I deal with the fact that, because of who I am, because of my skin color, they ignored me, sent me home in pain, as if I wasn't worth the effort?" Vanessa sighed, taking his hand. "I wish I had an answer. I just know that you are so much more than anything they tried to make you feel. And now you need to prove that to yourself." He sat in silence for a moment, Vanessa's words hanging in the air. She had always been his safe harbor, and now, more than ever, he needed to believe what she said. But there was something else that troubled him. "I thought about going back," he said finally, his voice low. Vanessa frowned. "Back? You mean, to the hospital?" David nodded. "Yes, to the first hospital. I feel like I need to see those faces again. Tell them that I survived, despite everything, and that I know what they did. I don't want to carry this forever." Vanessa looked at him for a moment, trying to gauge what that would mean for him. "If you think this will help you move forward, then I'm with you. But are you sure you're ready?" David clenched his fists, as if seeking courage within himself. "I don't know if I'm ready, but I need to do this." A few days later, David was ready to return to the hospital where it all began. He had talked to Marcus, who, of course, insisted on coming along. The plan was simple. David would go in, find the doctors or nurses who had treated him that day, and say what had been stuck inside him ever since. It wasn't about revenge, but about finding some way to close that chapter. When they arrived at the hospital, the environment seemed familiar but at the same time strange. Each step David took with his crutches brought him back to the moment he was ignored, treated like a statistic. Vanessa walked beside him, her presence silent and strong. Upon entering, a receptionist looked at David with curiosity. "How can I help you?" "I was here a few months ago. I had a car accident, and I was treated by a medical team that, let's say, didn't do their job right," David replied, his voice tense. "I'd like to speak with someone who was here that day." The woman looked at him, surprised by the request, and asked them to wait a moment. David and Vanessa sat in the waiting area, while Marcus stood by, observing people pass by. "I feel strange being here," David murmured to Vanessa. "It feels like I've traveled back in time." "That's normal. Just breathe, love." "You're here for a good reason," Vanessa replied, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. After a few minutes, a nurse who David vaguely recognized appeared. She looked at him with a confused expression, not understanding why he was back. "Can I help with something?" she asked, hesitantly. David took a deep breath before answering. "I was treated here a few months ago, after a car accident. Actually, I wasn't treated. I was ignored, sent home without proper tests, and almost became paralyzed because of it." The nurse turned pale, visibly uncomfortable with the revelation. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure who treated you at the time, but I'm sorry that this happened." David felt a lump forming in his throat. "You don't even remember me, do you?" "I remember you. I remember how you told me it was just muscle pain and sent me home, but it wasn't. It was something much more serious." Vanessa stood beside him, silently observing the nurse's reaction. Marcus, near the door, crossed his arms, trying to stay calm. I'm so sorry," the nurse repeated, not knowing what else to say. "I wasn't involved in the medical decisions, but I'm sorry for how things went." David shook his head, the weight of his words finally lightening a bit. "I just wanted you to know that I won't forget, and that it almost ruined my life." The nurse nodded, visibly unsettled. "I understand. And again, I'm so sorry." David turned to Vanessa and Marcus, ready to leave. "Let's go. I've said what I needed to." As they left the hospital, David felt a mix of emotions. The anger was still there, but somehow, he felt lighter. He had confronted those who had neglected him, and even though it didn't change the past, he was no longer bound by it. Vanessa looked at him as they walked back to the car. "How are you feeling?" David took a deep breath. "Better. Not completely, but better." And with that, he knew that the true recovery was just beginning. Sitting on the porch at home, David watched the quiet activity of the neighborhood. He had started using crutches less frequently, now relying on a cane, which was already a significant improvement for him. Beside him, Vanessa settled into a chair, a serene look on her face. "You seem at peace," Vanessa said, breaking the silence with a calm smile. David looked at her, reflecting. "I think I finally am. Not completely, but for the first time in months, I feel like I'm getting back to being myself, even after everything." Vanessa sighed, lightly touching David's hand. "It's been a long road, but you've made so much progress, and you'll keep making it." David smiled, but there was one question that still troubled him, something he couldn't stop thinking about. "I know I've overcome a lot, but I still wonder, why did things have to be this way, you know? Why did my skin color make me treated differently at that hospital? What did I do to deserve this?" Vanessa looked at him with eyes full of compassion. "You didn't do anything to deserve this, David. This is the weight of racism. It's not fair, and it doesn't make sense. But the important thing is that you didn't let it destroy you." David took a deep breath, looking at the horizon. "I know, but it's still hard to swallow. Marcus always said that fighting against the system is a constant battle, but living through it is different. I thought I had prepared my mind for it, but when it happened, I felt so powerless." Vanessa nodded, deeply understanding what he felt. No one is prepared for this kind of thing, and no matter how many times you go through it, the pain never lessens. But you've been strong, David, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. David thought about her words, and for a moment, the silence between them was comforting. Deep down, he knew that his recovery wasn't just physical. He was fighting to free himself from something much deeper, something that affected so many others like him. Soon after, Marcus arrived, bringing his usual air of optimism. "Hey folks, how's my favorite warrior doing today?" he asked, smiling as he sat in the other chair next to David. David smiled back. "I'm doing better than I was before." Marcus nodded, looking at his friend with admiration. "I knew you'd recover, man, but honestly, seeing it happen is even better than I imagined." David let out a short laugh. "Well, I'm far from being 100%, but at least I can leave the house without feeling like an invalid." Vanessa, smiling, added, "And he's starting to get impatient. That means he's really improving." Marcus laughed along with her. "That's good. But seriously, David, I was thinking, now that you're more stable, have you thought about doing something with everything you've been through? Like sharing your story? I know you've never been one for the spotlight, but there are a lot of people out there who need to hear what you have to say." David tilted his head, surprised by the suggestion. "Share my story? I never thought about that. What makes me special? People like me go through this every day." Marcus looked him straight in the eyes, his tone serious. "And that's exactly why you need to speak up. It's not just about what happened to you, but what it represents. Many of us go through similar things, but few get the chance to be heard. You have an opportunity to make a difference." David was silent for a moment, considering his friend's words. It was true that his experience wasn't unique, but maybe that was what made it important. He had suffered at the hands of a system that often neglected people like him, and many others were going through the same thing every day. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," David said slowly, "but maybe I should think about it." Vanessa smiled, supporting the idea. "I think it would be a powerful way to turn your pain into something positive. It could help others who are facing the same injustices." David was silent, watching the trees move in the wind. He knew he had a responsibility, a voice that could be heard, but at the same time, the idea of reliving everything that had happened still frightened him. "You don't have to decide now," Marcus said, noticing the conflict on David's face. "But just know that if you decide to share your story, you could open a lot of eyes. And that, man, is already a win." David nodded slowly. Maybe this was the next step in his healing journey, turning pain into something more, something that could help others feel less alone in their struggles. That night, lying in bed next to Vanessa, David reflected on everything that had happened so far. He had fought against his body, against the system, and against the ghosts that still haunted him. And now, for the first time in months, he felt that he might finally be approaching a new phase in his life. "Maybe sharing my story is the way to turn the page," he said softly, staring at the ceiling. Vanessa, with her head resting on his shoulder, smiled gently. "And I'll be here with you every step of the way." David turned to her, kissing her forehead. "I know, and that gives me strength." With this new perspective, David knew that the battle wasn't over. But this time, he was ready to face it head-on, with the support of the people he loved most and the understanding that his story mattered, not just to him, but to many others walking the same road. A few weeks later, David stood in front of a small group gathered at the community church. The room was filled with people who had come to hear his story. Vanessa, beside Marcus, watched with a proud smile. They had spent the past few days helping David prepare for this moment, the moment he would finally speak about everything that had happened. David looked at the audience and saw familiar faces, people from his community, co-workers, friends, and even some he didn't know personally but had heard about his story. The atmosphere was filled with anticipation and respect. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the responsibility he carried. This moment wasn't just about him, but about all the people who had experienced the same kind of discrimination and neglect. David began slowly. "I never thought I'd be here, standing in front of all of you, talking about what happened to me. In fact, for a long time, I tried to forget. I thought it would be easier to move on, leave it behind. But the truth is, Sometimes what we go through is too big to just ignore. He paused, remembering the conversations with Vanessa and Marcus, the hours of reflection, and the healing process he was still undergoing. A few months ago, I had a car accident. I was taken to the hospital and thought I'd be in good hands. After all, a hospital is a place where you go to be taken care of, right? But for me, that wasn't what happened. I was neglected, ignored. My diagnosis was wrong. My pain was dismissed. And deep down, I knew why. I knew that if I were a different person, of a different color, maybe the treatment would have been different. The silence in the room was profound. David's words echoed through the church, laden with truth and pain. I was sent home without knowing what was really wrong with me. I only discovered the severity of my condition days later, when I was finally seen by someone who saw me as a human being, not just a problem to be dispatched. And if it weren't for that, I might be in a wheelchair today. Marcus, sitting in the front row, watched attentively, proud of his friend. He knew this moment was the culmination of David's journey, a journey of suffering, resilience, and now, transformation. I thought about staying silent, David continued. I thought about moving on and never looking back. But the truth is, if I did that, I'd be letting the system continue doing to others what it did to me. And that's not how change happens. Vanessa looked at him with tears in her eyes, knowing how much David had fought to get here. She understood that every word was a step towards healing, not just for him, but for the entire community. Today, I'm here to tell my story because it's not just mine. It's the story of many of us, many who suffer in silence, who are ignored or treated differently because of the color of their skin. This needs to change, and the only way to change it is by speaking up, by exposing these painful truths. A man in the audience raised his hand. David, do you really think that by sharing your story, something will change? I mean, you suffered a terrible injustice, but the system is so big. What can we, as individuals, do? David looked at him, reflecting for a moment before responding. I don't know if my story will change the system by itself, but I do know that if we stay silent, nothing will change. Every voice counts, and only with many voices together can we make enough noise to be heard. Another person, an older woman, added, "You're right, David. I've been through similar situations myself and always felt powerless. I never thought my voice mattered." David nodded, moved. Your voice does matter. Each of us can make a difference, whether it's by speaking up, supporting those who do, or simply being present, fighting for respect and dignity. After a pause, he concluded, I'm not perfect, and my healing journey is far from over. But today, being here with all of you, sharing this story is an important step, and I hope it's just the beginning, not just for me, but for all of us. The room fell silent for a moment before the audience began to applaud. David felt a deep sense of relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He looked at Vanessa, who was smiling with pride, and then at Marcus, who nodded in satisfaction. After the event, as people approached to greet him and share their own stories, David realized that this moment wasn't the end but the beginning of something much larger. He had found a new mission, a new way to contribute to change. His voice, once silent, was now a powerful tool. Vanessa approached him and gave him a tight hug. You were amazing, love. I'm so proud of you. David smiled, still emotional. I only did it because I had you by my side. I don't know what I would have done without your support. Marcus joined them, patting David on the shoulder. Man, you did great. And this is just the beginning. Now that you've spoken up, you're going to inspire a lot of people to do the same. David looked at the two of them, feeling grateful and finally at peace. He had turned his pain into something that could help others, and that was more than he could have imagined at the start of his journey. You're right. This is just the beginning. Now, let's move forward and see what more we can do together. And with those words, David knew he was ready for whatever came next.